Hello everybody, welcome to today's video, final tips for AQA English Literature Paper 2, the exam coming up in a couple of days. What should you be doing over those next couple of days and how can you best prepare for the exam? This video should in no way replace your regular revision. You know I've got a video analysis of every poem, all of the texts, lots and lots of videos and revision guides for you to be studying from. But I just want to talk about what would I be doing at this point knowing that we're so close to the exam. Well, one of the things that I would do is I would rank the poems in terms of how well I know them and how well I can analyse them. It's always the same that we have a couple of poems we think, I don't really know that one, I just hope it doesn't come up. Well, take those poems and watch my video analysis of them. Print out a blank copy and see if you can annotate it with all of the things you can remember about the poem. This is a really good way of revising because obviously you might have a beautifully annotated anthology, but what you've got to be able to do is to take all of those points and put them into your brain because you don't get your anthology or even an anthology in the exam. You're given one poem and then you have to know the second poem and be able to refer to it. So I would definitely say revising the poems is important, and don't just choose the ones you like, but choose the ones that you think are perhaps the hardest to revise. The second thing to talk about is recapping quotations. You know my revision songs playlist. It was featured on Radio 1 a few days ago. If you didn't see that, I put the video up on the YouTube channel here. My Max Not Hot revision song. Well, of course, the Macbeth exam is now gone, but you've got quotation songs for the poetry, for an inspector calls, for many of the texts, and you need to be memorizing those quotations and recapping them and refreshing your memory about them. But what about when you're in the exam? So that's the things I would be focusing on is recapping and revising the texts and the poems and the quotations. But what about when you're actually in the examination? Well, this is an exam where choice is very, very important, okay? So in section A, let's say you're doing an inspector calls, there are two questions and you choose one of them. Obviously in section B, you're given a poem and you choose the poem you're going to compare to it. So choice, your decision making and your choice of question and your choice of second poem is really, really important. And I don't want you to rush into this because I know what happens for a lot of people. You quickly look at both inspector calls questions and you go with the one that you think is easiest. You quickly look at the named poem and you go with the first one that comes to mind to compare to it. And that is not always the best approach, okay? So what I would suggest you do with section A, whether you're studying an inspector calls or whatever text you're studying, is you look at both questions and you ask yourself not just which question is easiest here, which one do I think I could write simply and quickly about, but ask yourself which one do I think I can give the most sophisticated answer to, which one can I bring in my conceptualized response, my line of argument, a hypothesis that I'll explore throughout the answer. Don't just choose the one you think is easiest. In section B, you've got to choose your second poem. And we saw in the 2017 exam, choice of second poem will really determine in many ways how well you do. You could, in theory, compare any poem with any other poem, but you need to think beyond just one similarity. This would be my suggestion. So let's say the named poem was Ozymandias. You wouldn't then say, well, that's got sand in it and I'll choose Remains because that's got sand in it as well. You know, you wouldn't just think the kind of one simple thing that compares the poems. You need to think about, you've got to write a full answer here. Which poems compare well in terms of a full conceptualized response, a line of argument. So if it was Ozymandias, I would probably choose My Last Duchess because both poems present men who think they're powerful, particularly through the language in the poems, but then undermine that suggested power through the structure and the form. And that would be a nice line of argument. I'd spend half of my answer looking at how both poems present men as powerful. So in Ozymandias, I might look at the religious imagery of King of Kings. In My Last Duchess, I might look at the dramatic monologue form, the one-sided nature of the conversation. We never hear from the person he's speaking to. But then in the second half of my answer, I would look at how that power is undermined. Perhaps in Ozymandias with the changing sonnet form. It starts off, it's got some elements of a Petrarchan sonnet, some elements of a Shakespearean sonnet, some elements of something different again, and how the changing form of the sonnet reflects the changing nature of power and how Ozymandias doesn't actually attain the power he thinks he has, he is irrelevant a couple of thousand years later. In My Last Duchess, I'd then say the lack of power is shown perhaps through the one long stanza, the enjambment, the fact that the structure of the poem seems to reflect how he's just blurting out all of this kind of conversation. He's unable to control himself and stop what he's saying. And that would be a lot better, wouldn't it, than just thinking of one point where both of these poems have sand in them. And that's an exaggerated example, but what I'm saying is, when you are choosing your second poem, just think carefully about poems that you can say a range of things about, okay? And I've got a video on my channel which poems compare well, and that's just a suggestion of which poems I would pair up. You don't have to follow it, but you must be careful that you pair up two poems that there's plenty you can write about. It is possible to write about any two poems, but there are certainly some poems that are better to compare than others. The fourth thing I want to talk about is subject terminology, which has been such a hot point in the previous year's exams. Basically, what do we mean by subject terminology? We mean the language of the subject. And the key thing that AQA want to point out is there is no hierarchy of terminology. There are no words in terminology that are better than others. So you can use words like plot, setting, theme, and that's just as impressive as using words like the asyndetic list or oxymoron or caesura. You know, there's no kind of, oh, they've written about something clever here. So you do want to use subject terminology in your answer, but only where it is relevant in your answer and your answering of the question. This is not an exam where you just want to find devices and techniques and you're going to be credited for just using them. Finally, timing. Timing is so important in this exam because there's so much to do, including, of course, that final question, which is worth just 8 marks, the comparison of two unseen poems. So this is a 2-hour, 15-minute exam. There are 135 minutes in the exam. That means that you've got 135 minutes to achieve 96 marks, potential full marks 96. So it's about 1.5 minutes per mark available. Manage your timing, because if you don't, you'll get to the final question, you might not even get to write anything for it. As I say, this is just a recap of 5 points. Make sure you watch my videos on each of these sections of the exam, and good luck.